I came home late that evening, exhausted from another grueling day at work. The house was unusually quiet. Normally, I'd hear Dottie moving around the kitchen or see her watching TV, but that night, the silence was eerie. I didn't think much of it at first, just figured she'd gone out for a walk or was upstairs in the bedroom. I dropped my keys on the table and noticed a folded piece of paper resting near them, with my name written in her neat handwriting. George. It was odd. She never left me notes. My stomach tightened with a sense of unease, and I tore open the envelope, already dreading what was inside. As I unfolded the letter, my hands began to shake. The first few lines felt like a punch in the gut, knocking the wind right out of me. George, I'm sorry, but I have to leave. I've been lying to you for years. There's no easy way to say this, but I've been seeing someone else. His name is Paul. We were together before I met you, and we never really stopped. I had to sit down. The room spun as I read the words over and over, unable to comprehend. Paul? The name hit me like a freight train. Paul was her ex, the guy she had dated before me. The guy the first thought was long gone from our lives. But according to her, he had never left. They had been seeing each other for nearly 30 years, almost the entire length of our marriage. My heart pounded in my chest as my eyes flew over the next lines. I think Paul is the father of our children. The letter slipped from my hands and fluttered to the floor. For a moment, everything around me blurred. I could barely breathe. The weight of what she had written crushed me. Nearly 33 years of marriage, of love, of trust, of raising 3 kids together, and now, all of it was a lie? I stumbled to my feet, trying to catch my breath, but the shock was too overwhelming. I couldn't process it. My wife of more than 3 decades had been living a double life, and now she was gone, leaving me with the possibility that my children weren't even mine. The anger came in waves, crashing over the shock. How could she do this to me? How could she lie to me for so long? What kind of woman could carry on with her ex behind my back and pretend everything was normal? I grabbed the letter from the floor, crumpling it in my fist as I stormed toward the stairs. I needed answers. I needed to find her, confront her, and make sense of the madness. But when I reached our bedroom, it was empty. The closet doors hung open, and her side was bare. She had packed her things and left. Dottie was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My mind raced through the past 3 decades, sifting through every memory, searching for cracks, for signs I might have missed. How could I have been so blind? How could she have deceived me for so long? Images of our wedding day flashed through my head. Dottie, standing at the altar, looking beautiful in her white dress, promising to love me forever. And I believed her. I had spent my whole life believing her. I thought we were happy. I thought we had built something real together. But now, I wasn't even sure if our life had ever been real. The kids. God, what about the kids? I couldn't even wrap my head around that part. Paul might be their father? How is that possible? I had been there for their births, had watched them grow up, had taught them how to ride bikes, how to drive, how to be good, decent people. How could they not be mine? By morning, I felt like a hollow shell of myself, running on nothing but anger and disbelief. I called out of work, knowing there was no way I could show up and pretend like my life wasn't falling apart. Instead, I focused on what I needed to do next. I had to talk to the kids. I couldn't keep this from them, but I didn't even know how to begin that conversation. I made the call to our eldest, Michael, first. He was always the level-headed one, and I needed to hear his voice before I could face the others. Dad, everything okay? Michael's voice was laced with concern the moment he picked up. I hadn't called him this early in years. I need to talk to you, Mike. It's important. My voice cracked, but I tried to hold it together. Can you come by the house? What's going on? He asked, but I could tell he was already grabbing his keys. I'll be there in 20. As I waited for him, I stared at the family photos on the wall. Pictures of the kids from when they were little, growing up through the years, from kindergarten graduations to high school proms. All of it felt like a distant dream now, tainted by the doubt that gnawed at my insides. When Michael arrived, he looked worried, his face creased with concern as he stepped through the front door. Dad, you're scaring me. What's going on? I handed him the letter, unable to find the words. He took it from me, his brow furrowing as he read. I watched his face change, from confusion, to disbelief, to anger, the same emotions I had gone through. This can't be real, he stammered, shaking his head. Mom wouldn't do this. I didn't want to believe it either, I said, my voice raw. But she's gone, Mike. She left me. The weight of my words hung in the air, and I could see the devastation settle into his features. My son, my firstborn, now faced the same crushing reality I did. The life we thought we had was a lie. As the day wore on, the other kids came by. Jessica and Tyler were equally stunned, their faces etched with the same mixture of betrayal and confusion. None of us had seen it coming. We had trusted her, we had believed in her, and she had destroyed us. But as painful as it was to face my kids, I knew the next step. I had to find Paul. I had to look him in the eye and get the truth. If there was any chance that he could be the father of my children, I needed to know for sure. It didn't take long to find him. Paul lived in the same town, working at a hardware store on the other side of the city. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, didn't want to worry the kids. This was something I needed to handle on my own. When I walked into the store, Paul was behind the counter, his back turned as he stocked the shelves. I stood there for a moment, watching him, feeling the rage bubble up inside me. He was older now, a little thicker around the middle, but I recognized him instantly. The man who had stolen my wife for 3 decades without me knowing. I stepped forward, and the sound of my footsteps made him turn. The moment his eyes met mine, I saw the flash of recognition. He knew why I was there. "George," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Paul," I replied, my voice tight with anger. "We need to talk." Paul motioned to the back of the store, away from the few customers who were browsing the aisles. He knew why I had come, and I wasn't in the mood for a quiet, civil conversation. As soon as we reached the storage room, I slammed the door shut behind us and turned to face him. "You've been screwing my wife for 30 years, I growled, my voice low but shaking with rage. 30 damn years. And you never had the guts to say a word. You just sat there, hiding like a coward while I raised my kids, thinking they were mine." Paul didn't flinch. He just stared back at me, his face set in an expression that was infuriatingly calm. He looked older, more tired than I remembered. Maybe that's what 3 decades of betrayal did to a man. "I didn't know how to tell you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't even know if it was my place to say anything." "Your place? You've been sleeping with my wife. You think you have the right to decide what's your place?" Paul's eyes flickered with something, guilt, maybe, or regret. But it wasn't enough. Not for me. I wanted him to suffer. I wanted him to feel a fraction of the pain I'd been living with since I read that letter. "We were in love before you, George," he said quietly. "You know that. She and I, we never really got over each other." I took a step toward him, fists clenched at my sides, but I stopped myself from throwing the punch I so desperately wanted to. Instead, I let the words sink in. I had always known that Dottie had a life before me. Paul was part of that life, and I'd been stupid enough to believe that it had ended when she married me. But according to him, it never had. "And my kids?" I asked, my voice hard. "Are they yours?" Paul hesitated, and that hesitation spoke volumes. I knew what was coming, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. "I don't know for sure," he admitted. "But it's possible. Dorothy and we were still together when Michael was born. After that, things got complicated." My heart dropped into my stomach. Michael, my firstborn, the boy I had raised, taught to ride a bike, coached through Little League. All of it ran through my mind like a film reel, every memory suddenly tainted by the possibility that he wasn't mine. "You didn't stop after Michael?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You kept going?" Paul looked down, his silence an answer in itself. I couldn't take it anymore. The rage that had been boiling inside me finally erupted. I lunged at him, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. He didn't fight back, didn't even raise his arms to defend himself. I wanted to hit him, to make him bleed for every year he had stolen from me, for every lie he had helped Dottie tell. But instead, I just stood there, holding him by the throat, my breath ragged, my hands trembling. "You ruined my life," I said through gritted teeth. "You and Dottie, you've both ruined everything." "I'm sorry, George," Paul said. His voice strained. "I never wanted it to be like this." I let go of him, stepping back as the weight of everything came crashing down on me. My fists unclenched, and the anger began to drain from me, leaving nothing but a hollow emptiness. The truth was ugly, and there was no getting away from it. Dottie had betrayed me, but Paul had been right there with her, and now I was left to pick up the pieces. "I need to know," I said, my voice flat. "I need to know if they're mine." Paul nodded slowly. rubbing his neck where my hand had gripped him. "Get the tests done," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes. If they're mine, I'll deal with it." I left the store without another word, my mind already spiraling into the next stage of this nightmare. Paul might have said he didn't know for sure, but the doubt he had planted in my mind was unbearable. I had to get the answers. I had to know if my children, my own flesh and blood, were really mine or if I had been raising another man's kids for the last 3 decades. When I got home that night, I sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the family pictures lining the walls. Pictures of Michael, Jessica, and Tyler growing up, smiling, laughing, proud moments frozen in time. I had always thought of us as a close-knit family, bound by love and trust. But now, every one of those pictures felt like a lie. I didn't know if I was looking at my own children or someone else's. But there was more to uncover. As my anger cooled into something colder and more calculating, my mind wandered to Dixie, Dottie's best friend. She had been there through everything, through every family dinner, every holiday, every life event. If Dottie had been carrying on an affair with Paul for 30 years, there was no way Dixie hadn't known. I needed answers from her, too. The next day, I called her. "Dixie, it's George. We need to talk." There was a brief pause on the other end, and I could almost hear the tension in her voice when she finally replied. "George, what's going on? Is everything okay?" I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to scream down the phone. I knew she was lying. She had to be. "Can you come over to the house?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll explain everything when you get here." She hesitated again, but after a moment, she agreed. When Dixie arrived, she looked nervous, shifting uncomfortably as I led her into the living room. I didn't waste time. I handed her Dottie's letter, the one that had shattered my world, and watched as her eyes widened in shock. But it wasn't surprise that I saw on her face, it was guilt. "You knew, didn't you?" I asked, my voice sharp. "You knew about Paul, about their affair." Dixie didn't meet my eyes. She stared at the floor, twisting her hands together, her face pale. I didn't know everything," she said quietly. "But yes, I knew they were still in contact. I didn't think it was. I didn't think it was my place to say anything." "Not your place?" I snapped. "You stood by and watched while she lied to me for 30 years. You were her best friend. And you didn't think I deserved to know the truth?" Dixie's eyes welled up with tears, but I didn't feel sorry for her. I didn't have any sympathy left. "I didn't want to hurt you, George," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't think it would ever go this far. I thought it was just something from the past, something she would get over." I shook my head, my fists clenching in anger. It was the same excuse Dottie had given, that it was in the past, that it didn't matter. But it did matter. Every lie, every secret, every betrayal mattered. "You didn't think it would go this far?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You let it go on for 30 years. 30 years, Dixie. How could you do that to me? To our family?" Tears streamed down her face now, but I didn't care. I was done with people telling me they didn't want to hurt me while stabbing me in the back. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted this." I let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, well, neither did I. But here we are." For a long moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on us both. Dixie had been Dottie's closest friend, and now she was just another part of the lie that had destroyed my life. "I need you to leave," I finally said, my voice cold. "I can't look at you right now." Dixie nodded, wiping at her tears as she turned to go. But just as she reached the door, she paused and looked back at me. "For what it's worth, George," she said softly, "I really am sorry. I never wanted you to find out like this." And then she was gone, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my life. The days after my confrontation with Dixie passed in a blur. The anger I had felt, the betrayal, it was all still there, simmering beneath the surface. But there was something else now. An emptiness, a gnawing void that nothing could fill. Dottie had been my life, my partner for nearly 33 years. And now, I couldn't even be sure if the children I had raised with her were really mine. That uncertainty was eating me alive. I knew what I had to do. The only way to get any sort of closure was to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I had to take the paternity tests. There was no way around it. It took a few days to get everything organized. Michael, Jessica, and Tyler were confused when I called them, asking for a meeting. I couldn't tell them everything over the phone. I needed to see their faces, to try and explain the unexplainable. We gathered in the living room that had once been the heart of our family. The same room where Christmas mornings had been spent tearing open presents, where we had played board games and watched movies together. Now, it felt cold, almost foreign. Michael was the first to speak, his brows furrowed in concern. "Dad, what's going on? You sounded, I don't know, off when you called." I swallowed hard, my throat tight with the weight of what I was about to say. "I need to talk to you all about something. It's not going to be easy to hear." Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing at her brothers. "Is this about Mom?" I nodded. "Yeah, it's about your mother. But it's more than that." Taking a deep breath, I stood up and walked over to the fireplace, staring into the cold, empty grate. I couldn't look at them when I said the words. "Your mom and I. Well, she's been having an affair. For a long time. With someone from her past." The silence that followed was suffocating. I could feel their eyes on me, the shock, the disbelief. I braced myself for their reactions, knowing that what I had just dropped on them was only the beginning. "What do you mean?" Tyler asked, his voice strained. "How long?" 30 years, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She's been seeing him for almost as long as we've been married." The gasps from all three of them cut through the air like a knife. Jessica looked like she was about to cry, while Michael's face had gone white with anger. Tyler just sat there, stunned, unable to process what I had said. That's impossible," Michael said, shaking his head. "There's no way." "I wish it weren't true," I replied, finally turning to face them. "But it is. She left me. She's gone." Jessica buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as the tears started to fall. "How could she do this? How could she lie to us like that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't have any answers. But there's more." Michael stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth across the room. "More? What could possibly be worse than this?" I took another breath, steeling myself for the final blow. There's a chance that you might not be mine. That Paul, the man she's been seeing, could be your father." The room fell into a stunned, heavy silence. All three of them stared at me, their faces pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. The words hung in the air, too shocking, too horrible to sink in right away. Tyler was the first to speak, his voice a mix of confusion and anger. "What the hell are you talking about? What do you mean we're not yours?" "I don't know for sure," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That's why we need to take the tests. We need to know." Michael, always the rational one, crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw tight. "You're saying there's a possibility we're not your kids? That we're his?" I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Yes, it's a possibility." Jessica finally lifted her head, her face streaked with tears. "But you're our dad. You raised us. How can you not be our father?" "I don't want this to be true," I said, my voice breaking. "But we need to know. I can't live with the doubt anymore." There was a long, painful silence. No one knew what to say. I had just ripped open the fabric of our family, and there was no going back. But after a few moments, Michael sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's do the tests." The others nodded in agreement, though their faces were still filled with shock and confusion. We made plans to get the paternity tests done, and the tension in the room was unbearable. The bond we had once shared as a family was hanging by a thread, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. The waiting was the worst part. Every day that passed felt like a slow, tortuous countdown to an explosion. The paternity tests were sent off, and all we could do was wait for the results. I tried to go about my daily routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. The house was too quiet, too empty without Dottie. The echoes of the past haunted me at every turn. Michael, Jessica, and Tyler kept their distance. I understood why. They were dealing with their own emotions, trying to come to terms with the possibility that everything they had believed about their family might not be true. I couldn't blame them for needing space. I needed it, too. But that didn't stop the constant gnawing at the back of my mind. What if they weren't mine? What if the life I had built, the family I had loved, wasn't really mine at all? The thought kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the fear that everything I had known was a lie. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the results came in. I sat at the kitchen table, the envelope in my hands, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what I was hoping for. Did I want them to be mine? Or would it be easier if they weren't, if I could walk away from this nightmare and start over? But there was no starting over. No matter what the results said, I was tied to this family. To this pain, for the rest of my life. I opened the envelope with shaking hands, my eyes scanning the words on the page. Michael. He was mine. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I quickly moved on to the next result. Jessica. Not mine. The breath caught in my throat, and I felt the world tilt beneath me. I couldn't process it. My little girl, the one I had tucked into bed every night, the one I had walked down the aisle at her wedding, she wasn't mine. I forced myself to look at the final result. Tyler. Not mine. I dropped the papers onto the table, my head spinning. 2 out of 3. Only Michael was my biological child. Jessica and Tyler belonged to Paul. The man who had been sleeping with my wife behind my back for 30 years was their real father. I sat there for a long time, staring at the papers, feeling the weight of the truth settle over me like a suffocating blanket. I didn't know what to do, how to react. The anger was there, but so was the sorrow. The betrayal. The heartbreak. My family had been shattered, and now I had to figure out how to pick up the pieces. A few days later, I called a meeting with the kids. I couldn't keep the results from them, no matter how much it hurt. They had the right to know. We gathered in the same living room where I had dropped the bombshell on them before. The tension was palpable as they sat down, waiting for me to speak. I handed them the results, one by one, watching as they read the truth for themselves. Michael let out a long breath. His expression a mix of relief and guilt. I'm yours, he said quietly. But Jess and Tyler. Jessica's face crumpled as she read her result. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. I'm not yours? I shook my head, my heart breaking at the sight of her pain. No, you and Tyler, you're Paul's. Tyler didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the papers, his face pale and emotionless. I didn't know what he was feeling, and I didn't know how to reach him. Jessica broke the silence, her voice shaking. But you're still our dad, right? I mean, you raised us. That doesn't change. I looked at her, my chest tight with emotion. Of course I'm still your dad, I said softly. I'll always be your dad. Nothing will ever change that. But even as I said the words, I knew that things had already changed. We could never go back to the way things were. The truth was out, and it had left scars that might never fully heal. In the aftermath of the paternity test results, the house was quieter than ever. Michael, Jessica, and Tyler went back to their lives, trying to make sense of what they'd learned. We had talked, cried, and tried to reassure each other, but nothing could change the fact that our family had been built on lies. I was still their father in every way that mattered, but the knowledge that Paul was their biological father created a distance between us, one that couldn't easily be bridged. Days passed, but I couldn't move on. I found myself fixating on everyone who had played a part in the deception, Paul. Of course, but also Dixie and Joe. Joe, who had been my friend for years, who had sat across from me at barbecues, toasted me at family gatherings, and never once let on that he knew my wife was having an affair. The more I thought about it, the more the anger built inside me. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them sitting around in an empty house, stewing in my thoughts. So, one morning, I drove over to Joe and Dixie's house, determined to confront him. I didn't call ahead. I didn't want to give him the chance to come up with excuses. Joe was outside working on his car when I pulled up. He didn't see me at first, too focused on the engine in front of him, but when I slammed my car door shut, he looked up. His expression shifted from curiosity to concern when he saw the look on my face. George, what's going on? He asked, wiping his hands on a rag as he walked over. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. You knew, didn't you? I said, my voice hard. You knew about Paul and Dottie. About the affair. Joe froze, his eyes widening. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at me like a deer caught in the headlights. Then he opened his mouth, but I didn't give him a chance to respond. You've been my friend for years, Joe. You've been in my home, around my kids, and all this time you knew my wife was cheating on me. How could you not tell me? Joe's face paled, and he held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. George, listen, I didn't know for sure. Don't give me that, I snapped, stepping closer. Don't lie to me now. Dixie knew, and you expect me to believe you didn't? He swallowed hard, looking down at the ground for a moment before finally meeting my gaze. Okay, yes, I knew. But it's not like I had all the details. I knew they were seeing each other, but I didn't know how long it had been going on or how serious it was. That's not good enough, I growled. You knew she was betraying me, and you didn't say a word. You let me live in ignorance while my wife was sneaking around behind my back. Joe ran a hand through his thinning hair, clearly uncomfortable. I didn't know what to do, George. It's not like I wanted to get involved in your marriage. I figured it was between you and Dottie. You figured it was between us? I repeated, incredulous. So you just let it happen? Let me keep living in a lie? You didn't think I deserved to know? He shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the house as if looking for a way out of the conversation. But there was no escape. I wasn't letting him off that easy. I'm sorry, he said finally. I should have told you. I didn't want to blow up your life. Well, guess what, Joe? I said, my voice rising. My life's already blown up. It's in pieces because of Dottie, because of Paul, and because of people like you who decided it wasn't your place to tell me the truth. Joe took a step back, clearly taken aback by my anger. But I wasn't done. Do you have any idea what it's like to find out that the woman you've loved for over 30 years has been lying to you? To find out that 2 of the kids you raised might not even be yours? That you've been living a lie for decades? Joe's eyes widened even further. What do you mean, might not be yours? George, are you saying? They're Paul's, I said flatly, cutting him off. Jessica and Tyler. They're not mine. I took the tests. Joe's face fell, and for a moment, he looked genuinely horrified. Jesus, George, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know it was that bad. Well, now you do, I said coldly. And you still kept your mouth shut. You let me be the fool. He shook his head, his expression pained. I'm sorry. Man, I really am. If I could go back and do it differently, I would. But I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't want to destroy your family. Newsflash, Joe, I said, my voice dripping with bitterness. My family's already destroyed. There was a long silence between us, the weight of everything hanging in the air. Joe looked like he wanted to say more, to somehow fix what couldn't be fixed. But I was done. There was nothing more he could say that would make a difference. I don't know what to say. George, he said quietly. I really am sorry. Sorry doesn't cut it, I replied. I trusted you, and you let me down. I don't know if I can ever forgive that. With that, I turned and walked back to my car, leaving Joe standing there in the driveway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The anger was still burning inside me, but underneath it was something else, something colder. I didn't just feel betrayed by Dottie and Paul. I felt betrayed by everyone who had known and said nothing. And that included Joe. As I drove away, I realized that my life, the life I had known, was over. There was no going back to the way things were. I had to find a way to move forward, but I didn't know where to start. After the confrontation with Joe, I spent days in a fog, unsure of my next move. It wasn't just the affair, the kids, or the betrayal from those around me. It was everything at once. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of lies, and no matter how hard I tried to stay afloat, the weight of it all kept pulling me under. I needed to take control, to find a way to turn the tables on the people who had wronged me. That's when the idea came to me. Paul had taken my wife, my family, and years of my life. He had lived in the shadows, quietly tearing apart everything I held dear. But he hadn't just taken from me. He had stolen something much bigger, my identity as a father, a husband, a man with a stable family. And now, it was time to take something back. I began to plan. The first step was simple. I started documenting everything. The letters Dottie had written, the results of the paternity tests, the conversations I had had with Dixie and Joe. It was all laid out in meticulous detail. I wanted a record of every lie, every betrayal, every moment that had been taken from me. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew I needed it. Evidence, as it were. I spent hours late into the night combing through old photos, emails, anything I could find that would piece together the timeline of Dottie's affair with Paul. I wasn't just looking for proof of their relationship. I was looking for holes in their story, weaknesses I could exploit. If they thought they could tear me down and walk away unscathed, they were wrong. The second step was harder. I needed to confront Dottie. Not in person, not yet. But I needed to make her aware that I wasn't going to let this go. So, I wrote her a letter. Not an emotional plea, not a rant. It was cold, calculated, and to the point. Dear Dottie, you've made your choices. And you've left me with no choice but to make mine. I want you to understand that your lies and betrayal will not go unchallenged. You've taken years of my life, and now I intend to take something back. You've told me Paul is the father of Jessica and Tyler, and I've confirmed it through tests. I don't want to hear any more apologies. What I want now is to ensure that the truth comes to light for everyone. You may have left, but you don't get to leave without consequences. I will be pursuing legal action. And I suggest you prepare for what's coming. You've destroyed this family, and I won't let you walk away from it as if it never happened. George. It wasn't a letter I expected her to respond to. It was a warning shot, a signal that I wasn't the man she had left behind. I wasn't going to fade into the background while she and Paul carried on with their lives. I was going to fight back. After I sent the letter, I waited. Days passed without any response from Dottie, and I began to wonder if she had even read it. But then, one evening, just as I was getting ready to go to bed, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from her. We need to talk. The message was brief, but it was all I needed. She was rattled. She didn't expect me to fight back, and now that she saw I wasn't going to go quietly, she was nervous. Good. It was time for her to feel what I had been feeling all these years. But Dottie wasn't the only one I was targeting. Paul was next on my list. And unlike Dottie, I wasn't going to send him a polite letter. No, I had something much bigger planned for him. I had been doing some research, digging into Paul's life. He wasn't just a guy who had an affair with my wife. He was a well-known figure in the community, a successful businessman with a reputation to uphold. And I knew exactly how to hit him where it hurt the most. I wasn't going to confront him in some dramatic face-to-face showdown. No, that was too easy. Too predictable. I was going to dismantle his life from the shadows, the way he had done to mine. And so, I began making phone calls, reaching out to people who could help me expose Paul for the fraud he was. Every detail of his affair with Dottie, every lie he had told, every secret he had kept, I was going to make sure it all came to light. His business, his reputation, his life, I was going to burn it to the ground. By the time I was done, Paul wouldn't just lose Dottie. He would lose everything. And that, I thought, was only fair. I didn't have to wait long after Dottie's cryptic message. 2 days later, she called. Her voice was unsteady, wavering in that way it used to when she was nervous. But this wasn't the same Dottie I'd known for 30 years. This was a woman I barely recognized anymore. George, can we meet? She asked, almost too softly, as if she feared my answer. I let the silence hang for a moment, considering. Every part of me wanted to slam the phone down, to let her drown in the mess she'd created. But another part of me, the part still haunted by decades of marriage, of memories and shared history, couldn't resist hearing what she had to say. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, maybe I wanted to see how low she could sink. Either way, I agreed. Tomorrow, I said, at the diner on Main Street, 11 a.m. Don't be late. I hung up before she could respond. The next morning, I arrived early. The diner was almost empty, just a few people scattered at tables, minding their own business. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching cars pass on the street. My mind replaying every betrayal over and over like a bad movie I couldn't shut off. Every lie, every secret she'd kept from me. Dottie walked in 10 minutes late. Typical. She scanned the room nervously until she saw me, then slowly made her way to the table. She looked tired, older, somehow, as if the weight of everything was finally catching up to her. But I wasn't in the mood to pity her. George, she began, sitting down across from me. Her hands fidgeted with the napkin in front of her, and she avoided looking me directly in the eyes. I got your letter. Good, I said flatly. I took a sip of my coffee, not bothering to offer her anything. So, what do you want? She winced at my tone but kept going. I didn't expect things to get so out of control, she said. I never meant for it to go this far. 30 years, I interrupted. You didn't expect things to get out of control, but you lied to me for almost 30 years? You had a whole other life with Paul behind my back. How do you not expect that to get out of control? Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. She'd cried her share of crocodile tears over the years. This wasn't going to sway me. I know, she whispered, dabbing her eyes with the napkin. But I never wanted to hurt you, George. You have to believe me. It just happened. I set my cup down with a hard clink, my patience wearing thin. Things like this don't just happen, Dottie. Affairs don't last almost 3 decades by accident. You made choices, and now you're going to deal with the consequences. She seemed to shrink into her chair, her hands trembling. I didn't think you'd find out, she admitted quietly. I thought I could keep it separate, that you'd never know. And how did that work out for you? I said coldly. I know about Paul. I know about Jessica and Tyler. I know you've been lying to me since the beginning. So now what, Dottie? What do you expect me to do? Her face crumpled as she tried to hold back more tears. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know what to do. I need you to understand that it wasn't all a lie. I did love you, George. I still do. I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter, hollow sound. Love? You call this love? You spent 3 decades lying to me, letting me think I was raising my own children while you were sneaking around with Paul. And now you want to tell me it was love? She looked at me, her eyes wide with desperation. I never wanted it to end like this. Well, it did, I said, leaning forward, my voice low but firm. You ended it, and now, you're going to face the consequences. I've already spoken to a lawyer, Dottie. We're going to court. I'm suing for everything. Her face paled. George, no. Please, don't do that. We can work something out. You don't have to take everything from me. I shook my head. I'm not the one who took everything, Dottie. You did. And now, it's your turn to lose. She was silent for a moment, her hands trembling again as she reached for her purse. When she looked up at me again, there was a hint of steel in her eyes. You don't have to do this, George. You don't have to destroy everything. I'm not destroying anything, I said, standing up. I'm just making sure you face the consequences of your actions. Without another word, I turned and left the diner, leaving Dottie sitting there with her hands shaking, her eyes filled with the tears of a woman who had lost everything. But it wasn't over, not yet. There was still Paul, and he had a lot more to lose. I didn't waste any time after that meeting with Dottie. It was clear that she was unraveling, that she had no idea what was coming next. And Paul? He was still sitting comfortably, probably thinking that he'd gotten away with everything. But I wasn't done. I had spent weeks gathering information, piecing together every scrap of evidence I could find that tied Paul to Dottie's affair, to the destruction of my family. I wasn't just looking for proof of their relationship anymore, I was looking for leverage. Something I could use to bring him down, to ruin the life he'd built on my wife's lies. And then, I found it. It wasn't hard, really. Paul had always been a bit too arrogant, too sure of himself. He wasn't just a successful businessman. He was the kind of man who liked to flaunt his success, to make sure everyone knew just how important he was. But when you dig deep enough into someone's life, especially someone like Paul, you always find something. I discovered that Paul's business wasn't as clean as he liked to pretend. There were deals he'd made that were less than legal, connections he had with people who operated in the shadows. It was enough to get him in serious trouble if it ever came to light. So, I made sure it did. I compiled everything I'd found, emails, financial records, witness statements from people who had worked with him. And then I sent it to the right people. Lawyers, reporters, anyone who could take the information and turn it into a full-blown scandal. It didn't take long. Within days, news broke about Paul's shady business dealings. His name was splashed across the headlines, his reputation in tatters. Clients pulled out of deals, investors backed away, and his company's stock plummeted. It was chaos, and I reveled in it. I watched from the sidelines as Paul's life unraveled, as the empire he'd built on lies and deceit came crashing down around him. He was no longer the successful, confident man who had taken my wife from me. He was a man fighting to keep his head above water, scrambling to save what little he had left. And I didn't feel an ounce of pity for him. But that wasn't enough for me. Ruining his business was satisfying, but it wasn't personal enough. I wanted him to feel the same pain I had felt, to know what it was like to lose everything. So, I took the final step. I leaked the story of his affair with Dottie. It was a simple enough task. I had all the evidence I needed, photos, emails, even a few people who had seen them together over the years. I sent it to the same reporters who had covered the business scandal, and within days, Paul's personal life was front-page news. The fallout was immediate. His wife left him, his children refused to speak to him, and the community he had once been a respected part of turned on him. He was no longer the powerful, successful man who had everything. He was a pariah, shunned by everyone who had once admired him. And I couldn't have been happier. For the first time in months, I felt like I had control again. I had taken back something from the man who had stolen my life, my family. I had turned the tables, and now Paul was the one suffering. But even as I watched his life fall apart, a part of me couldn't shake the emptiness that lingered. I had won, but at what cost? My marriage was still over. My family was still shattered. And no amount of revenge could change that. I had destroyed Paul, but in the process, I had become someone I barely recognized. As satisfying as it was to watch Paul's life crumble, I knew there was still unfinished business. Dixie, Dottie's oldest friend, had played a key role in hiding the affair. She had known about it for years, even encouraged it, covering for Dottie every time she sneaked away to be with Paul. And Joe, Dixie's husband, was just another piece in this game. Whether he knew about it or not didn't matter anymore. The fact that Dixie had kept this secret, knowing it would destroy me if it came out, made her complicit. It was time to pay her a visit. I hadn't spoken to Dixie since everything had come to light. I figured she was keeping her distance, waiting for the dust to settle. Maybe she thought I'd never come for her, that I'd focus all my anger on Dottie and Paul. But Dixie had underestimated me, just like everyone else. I drove to their house late in the evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the front lawn. Their place was as pristine as always, a perfect suburban home, the kind of place that screamed normalcy from the outside. But I knew better now. This whole town was built on secrets, and Dixie had more than her share. I knocked on the door, my hand steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts racing through my mind. I had rehearsed this moment over and over again, the confrontation I'd been planning for weeks. The door opened, and there she was, wearing her typical forced smile. "George," Dixie said, her voice tinged with surprise but not entirely with warmth. "I wasn't expecting." "Let's not pretend, Dixie," I cut her off. "You knew I'd come eventually." Her eyes flickered with something, fear, maybe, but she stepped aside and let me in. The house smelled of lavender and polished wood, everything in its place. As if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. This place wasn't as pristine as it seemed. It was tainted now, just like my life. We walked into the living room, and she motioned for me to sit. I remained standing. I wasn't here for a casual chat. "I don't have time for small talk," I said, my voice hard. "I want to know how long you've been covering for Dottie." Dixie's smile faltered, and she shifted uncomfortably on her feet. "George, don't lie to me," I snapped, taking a step closer. "I'm not in the mood for your excuses." "How long?" She bit her lip, her eyes darting to the floor. "It wasn't like that, George. I didn't want to get involved, but Dottie, she begged me not to say anything. She told me it was a mistake, that it wouldn't happen again." "How many times did she make that same mistake, Dixie?" "Over 20 years? You knew she was sleeping with Paul while I was raising those kids, thinking they were mine. And you didn't say a damn thing." Her face went pale. "I didn't know it was that serious." You thought wrong," I said coldly. "You were supposed to be our friend. My friend. And you betrayed me." Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't moved. I had seen enough fake tears to last a lifetime. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered. I didn't know what to do. Dottie was my best friend. She told me she was in love with Paul, but she didn't want to leave you. She was torn, George. She didn't know what she wanted. And you just stood by, watching it all happen?" I asked, my voice rising. "You watched as she destroyed our marriage, as she lied to me every day. You could have stopped it. You could have said something." Dixie's tears spilled over now, but I didn't care. "I was scared," she choked out. "I didn't know how to handle it. I thought it would end on its own. I never wanted it to go this far." I shook my head in disbelief. "You didn't want it to go this far? It went on for decades. You were complicit. Dixie. You lied for her. You helped her cover it up. Do you have any idea what that's done to me?" She broke down completely now, sobbing into her hands. I watched her, feeling a cold detachment. The Dixie I had known was gone. This woman before me was a stranger, someone who had helped ruin my life. And no amount of tears was going to change that. "George, I'm sorry," she wept. "I'm so sorry. I should have said something. I should have done something." I let her cry for a moment, but my anger didn't waver. "Sorry doesn't fix anything, Dixie. Sorry doesn't give me back 30 years of my life. It doesn't change the fact that I've lost everything." She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "Please, George, I didn't mean for any of this." I stared at her for a long moment, then turned to leave. "You didn't mean for it, but it happened. And now you'll have to live with it." As I walked out the door, the weight of what had just transpired settled on me. Confronting Dixie didn't bring the closure I had hoped for. If anything, it left me feeling more hollow than before. But there was still Joe. He was the last piece of this twisted puzzle. Confronting Joe felt like walking into the unknown. While Dixie had been complicit in hiding Dottie's affair, Joe was an enigma. Did he know? Did he suspect? Or was he just another fool like me, blind to the lies happening right under his nose? I didn't wait long to find out. I called Joe the next day, asking him to meet me at a bar we used to frequent in the old days. He sounded confused but agreed. When I arrived, he was already sitting at the bar, nursing a beer, looking as calm and unbothered as ever. I sat down next to him and ordered a drink, neither of us saying anything at first. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick between us. I didn't know how to start, but Joe, in his usual straightforward way, broke the ice. "So, what's going on, George? Dixie told me you stopped by yesterday. Something about Dottie?" I took a sip of my drink, feeling the burn of the alcohol as it went down. "You know why I'm here, Joe. You know what this is about." He looked at me, frowning. "I'm not sure I do." I turned to face him, my eyes boring into his. "How long have you known about Dottie and Paul?" Joe blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. He looked away, taking a long pull from his beer before answering. "I didn't. I suspected something was going on, but I didn't know for sure." "Suspected?" I said, my voice rising slightly. "You suspected your wife's best friend was having an affair for almost 3 decades. And you didn't say anything?" Joe shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "It wasn't my place, George. I wasn't sure, and Dixie never said anything. I figured if it was true, it would come out eventually." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "It wasn't your place? You stood by and watched as your wife covered for Dottie, as she helped her keep this secret from me, and you thought it wasn't your place?" Joe set his beer down on the bar, his jaw tightening. "Look, George, I didn't know it was like that. I thought maybe they had a fling, but I didn't think it was serious. I didn't know about the kids or how long it had been going on." I shook my head in disbelief. "So you just turned a blind eye. You let your wife lie to me for years, knowing it could destroy my family." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't think it was my business, man. I didn't want to get involved." "Well, now you're involved," I said coldly. "And you're just as guilty as Dixie. You both let this happen. You both stood by and watched as my life fell apart." Joe's face hardened. "I'm not guilty of anything, George. I didn't have an affair with your wife." "No," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "But you knew. And you did nothing. That makes you just as responsible." We sat there in silence, the tension between us thick and palpable. I could see the guilt flickering across Joe's face, but he wasn't going to admit it. He wasn't going to take responsibility for his part in this. "I don't know what you want from me," Joe said finally, his voice quiet. "I can't change what happened." "No, you can't," I said, standing up. "But you're going to live with it. Just like Dixie. Just like me." As I walked out of the bar, leaving Joe behind, I realized something. Revenge didn't feel like I thought it would. I had exposed Dottie, destroyed Paul, confronted Dixie, and now Joe. But none of it had brought me the closure I was searching for. Instead, it left me feeling more lost, more empty than ever before. The weeks after my confrontation with Joe were a blur. I'd gone through every stage of anger and bitterness imaginable, and yet here I was, still feeling hollow. It was as though the bottom had fallen out of my world, and no matter how much I tried to claw my way back to solid ground, it kept slipping further away. Dottie had reached out to me a few more times, each message more desperate than the last. She begged for forgiveness, pleaded to talk things through, and even offered a mediated conversation with the kids. But I wasn't ready to see her again, not after everything. The mere thought of sitting down with her, pretending that there was something left to salvage, made my blood boil. My lawyer had already begun the legal process. The divorce was inevitable, and with the evidence of her affair, I had the upper hand. Dottie would lose everything: the house, the savings, the reputation she had built in the community. It was poetic justice. Yet, the more the legal machinery ground on, the more empty the victory felt. I wasn't winning, I was just watching everything we'd built disintegrate. One morning, I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring out at the backyard where the kids had once played, when my phone rang. It was Jessica. My stomach twisted. The kids had been distant since the revelations, understandably so. Jessica had texted a few times, but it was always short, guarded. Tyler hadn't spoken to me at all. They were old enough to understand what was happening, but that didn't make it any easier. How do you tell your children that the mother they'd trusted their whole lives was a liar? That their entire existence had been built on deception? I picked up the phone, bracing myself. "Hey, Jess." "Dad," she began, her voice quiet. "Can we talk? I've been meaning to, for a while now." My heart pounded. "Of course. What's on your mind?" There was a pause, a long stretch of silence that told me this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. "Tyler and I have been talking," she said finally. "About everything. About you, Mom, Paul, all of it." I waited, letting her find the words. "We don't know what to think anymore," she admitted. "I mean, you raised us, Dad. You've always been there for us. But, if what Mom said is true, and Paul might be our biological father, then, what does that make us? What does that make you?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I had dreaded this moment, knowing it would come eventually. The kids were grappling with an identity crisis that I couldn't fix. They were questioning their entire existence, just like I had when I first learned the truth. "You're my kids," I said firmly. "That's what it makes you. I don't care what the DNA says, Jess. I'm the one who raised you. I'm the one who's been there through everything. Paul may have been involved with your mom, but he's not your father. Not in the ways that matter. But what if we're not really yours?" She pressed, her voice trembling. "What if Paul is our real dad?" I closed my eyes, the pain of her words sinking deep. "Blood doesn't make a father, Jess. I'm your dad because I love you, because I've always loved you. Nothing can change that." She didn't respond right away, and I could hear the emotion in her silence. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know how to handle this. Tyler's angry. He won't talk to anyone, not even me. And I'm just lost." "I know," I said softly. "I'm lost too." There was a long pause before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think we should get a DNA test? To find out for sure?" My heart stopped. The very thought of it terrified me. A test would put everything into cold, hard numbers. It would tell us, without a shadow of a doubt, whether I was their father or not. And once that truth was out, there would be no going back. "Jess, listen to me," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I understand why you'd want to know. But no matter what that test says, it won't change how I feel about you or your brother. I'm always going to be your dad. That's the only thing that matters." She didn't say anything for a moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was filled with uncertainty. "I don't know, Dad. I don't know what to do. I'm here for you," I told her. "Whatever you decide, I'll be here. Just remember that I love you. That's not going to change." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing. The possibility of a DNA test loomed over me like a storm cloud, but I couldn't bring myself to push for it. The truth had already done enough damage. Did we really need more? The kids would have to make their own decisions about this. All I could do was stand by them and hope that, in the end, love would be enough. The weeks that followed were a slow, painful march toward resolution. The divorce papers were finalized, the assets divided. Dottie lost the house, most of her savings, and her place in the community. She had become a ghost of her former self, hiding from the judgmental stares of neighbors and former friends who now knew the truth. Paul, too, had disappeared from the public eye, his business in shambles and his reputation ruined. But none of that brought me peace. In fact, as the dust began to settle, I realized that revenge hadn't filled the void inside me, it had only deepened it. I was still broken, still grappling with the betrayal that had torn my life apart. And now, I faced the most difficult part of all, moving on. One morning, as I sat in the living room surrounded by boxes of things I hadn't unpacked since Dottie left, I found myself thinking about what came next. My life had been defined by this marriage. This family, for so long that I didn't know who I was without it. I had spent so much energy seeking justice, tearing down the people who had wronged me, that I hadn't stopped to consider what I actually wanted for myself. I picked up a photo of Jessica and Tyler from when they were kids, smiling in front of a Christmas tree, blissfully unaware of the secrets that would one day tear us apart. I had been happy then, genuinely happy, or at least I thought I had been. But that happiness was built on lies. What did that mean for the future? Could I ever find real happiness again? A knock on the door pulled me out of my thoughts. I set the photo down and went to answer it, half expecting to see Dottie or one of the kids. Instead, it was Joe. I hadn't spoken to him since our confrontation at the bar. I figured we were done with each other, that the friendship we'd once had was dead and buried. But here he was, standing on my porch, looking like a man who'd been through hell. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice rough. I hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. We walked into the living room, the tension between us thick and uncomfortable. He glanced around at the boxes, at the half-packed remnants of a life that no longer existed. "I didn't think I'd see you again," I said, sitting down on the couch. Joe sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't think I'd be back here either. But I needed to talk to you." I leaned back, waiting. "About what?" He sat across from me. His shoulders slumped, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen him. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About how I knew and didn't do anything. And, you're right, I should have said something. I should have done something. But I didn't. And I have to live with that." I didn't say anything, letting his words hang in the air. "I'm sorry, George," he continued, his voice quiet. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to know that I regret how I handled things. I should have been a better friend. I looked at him, seeing the pain in his eyes. There was a part of me that wanted to lash out, to remind him of the damage he'd caused by staying silent. But another part of me, the part that was tired, that wanted to move on, felt something else. Maybe it was the beginning of forgiveness, or maybe it was just the need to let go of the anger that had consumed me for so long. "Joe," I said slowly, "we all screwed up. You, me, Dottie. None of us handled this right. But I'm done holding on to it. I can't live like this anymore." He nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Neither can I." We sat in silence for a while, two broken men trying to find a way forward. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to stop fighting, to stop tearing down the people around me. It was time to let go. "I'm leaving town," Joe said after a long pause. "I think Dixie and I need a fresh start. Maybe we can figure things out, maybe we can't. But we can't stay here anymore." I understood. This town was filled with too many memories, too much pain. Maybe I needed a fresh start too. As Joe stood to leave, I felt a strange sense of closure. We weren't friends anymore, but we weren't enemies either. We were just two men trying to pick up the pieces of our lives. After he left, I stood in the doorway, staring out at the street. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the front yard. I had spent so much time trapped in the darkness of betrayal. But now, for the first time, I felt like there was a path forward. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But it was there. I closed the door, turning back to face the remnants of my old life. It was time to pack up, to move on, and to figure out what came next.